Good evening, everyone. This is the Black Post. This afternoon, we'll be discussing why Africa, the richest continent, has all the poorest countries in the world. Now, not all the poorest countries, but most of the poorest countries in the world. I believe this is a very topic for foundational Black Americans, all for those melanated communities around the world, whether you live in the Caribbean or Europe, and also Australia and Canada. This is very important. The one thing that made me think about this is all the major resources are located in Africa. And I continue to ask myself, why is Africa, our neighboring homeland, is the poorest continent? Or rather, the richest continent with the poorest countries? Well, first, I had to define what a continent was because I remember growing up as a small child that continents were surrounded by water, almost like an island, but a bigger landmass. So the one thing I looked at, continents are usually surrounded by water. Geographers have named 7 continents, and they named them as Africa, Asia, Australia, Antarctica, Europe, North America, and South America. That is what we were told. That is what we were informed about. So then again, I did another search and I just looked up continent. And it says here that a continent, any of the world's main continuous expansions of land, and named the 7 continents as well. And it says the mainland of Europe as distinct from the British Isles. And then down here, a mainland contrasted with islands. And I realized there's more continents, or rather there's less continents, what we have been informed of. And we're going to break this down and really have a good discussion about not only continents, but mainly the continent of Africa and all of its rich resources versus the Western world, mostly the United States of America, all the countries in Europe like France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, Great Britain, just to name a few. And how the Western world has literally stolen, leached, bad faith contracts, has ripped Africa of literally all their natural resources and continue to do so today. This is not ended with worldwide supremacy. And some of you may have the question knowing, why is Africa as a continent so poor with all of those countries where they're sitting on the richest lands imaginable? So I posed the question once again on Google, because we understand this is how the white supremacists work. They show you one thing, they mean another. So what the one thing they don't refer to and or talk about is colonization of the African continent in the many countries. Because as I look around the different countries that are within the continent of Africa, I see countries like Mozambique and Angola that speak Portuguese. Where does the Portuguese language come from? Portugal. You look at countries like Senegal, Ivory Coast. You look at these countries and you say, well, what is the natural language? What is the spoken language? For those countries, it's French. What is French from? France. You look at other countries like Kenya, Ghana, to name a couple. What are their language that they speak? English. Who speaks English? People from England, people from Great Britain, people from the continent of yours. We're going to get more into the continent and the placement, because I think it's important that we look at these things with a private eye. And this is what I mean. So when I'm looking at all the different continents, correct? So we have North America that encompasses Canada, United States, and Mexico. We have South America. We have Europe, okay, which is a conglomerate group of all these different small countries combined together, like Spain and Portugal and France and Germany and Turkey, Romania, Ukraine, Poland, Denmark, the UK, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, etc. That makes up majority of Europe. Greece, Italy. And then you come over to Asia, where you have Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China, North and South Korea, Japan, India, and also Russia, being the largest Asian country. But we know Russians are not essentially what we like to depict as an Asian person. They look just like a regular European. You come down, you have the continent of Africa, as well as the continent of Australia. And then last but not least, way at the bottom, you have the continent of Antarctica, where no one really lives except scientists doing research. They're probably still looking for oil. Now, the one thing that you should notice that a lot of these continents, especially North America, is completely surrounded by water, right? There's nothing else connected to it. Believe it or not, if you blow this map up, there is breakage between Mexico and Belize and Honduras, so it's not connected to South America. But we know those countries as well is located within the Caribbean. And then you have South America with largely countries of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. So we know about these countries, correct? And then, of course, the 54 countries that are in Africa, we know about those countries as well. The Middle East, that we don't essentially associate with Africa nor Europe, which is Iraq, Jordan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Syria, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, Armenia. And then we have Australia. But the one thing that we're not really looking at is that surrounded by Australia, there's another country on the opposite side to the north. It's called Greenland, which they nowadays call Denmark. And this is completely surrounded by water, but this is not a continent because we understand that Denmark essentially falls under who? The UK. My question is, how did the United Kingdom become so powerful? Look at this country in comparison to Russia, in comparison to China, in comparison to Mongolia. It is because the UK is probably the hub, it's probably the center of white supremacy, with Spain and Portugal right beside them, as well as France. And after they got finished fighting amongst themselves, they began to go out in conglomerate groups as entourages to conquer and colonize other people. Now, when they came upon the continent of Africa, they saw a different type of people. They saw melanated people. And the one thing they wanted to do was take their land just as well as they were taking each other's land in Europe. They didn't want to do contracts and deals. They wanted to conquer them and colonize them, to cultivate and mine their land of their natural resources because they have none. Mostly all of the riches in the European nations come from the continent of Africa. They come from the continent of Africa. And when we look at those resources, family, what we see is from top to bottom, Africa has many resources to offer the world. Now, why is this important to foundational Black Americans, Native Black Americans, and Native Americans who are melanated? Why is this important? Because if not, this continent was colonized, then our brothers and sisters, or those who have similar features than us, we would have been doing business with them, making millions and millions of dollars. Because more times than not, you like to do business with people that look like you, unless you have been brainwashed. unless you have been a plunge on the system of white supremacy. So as we're looking at this, we see that they have petroleum, gas, gold, phosphate, iron ore, fish, titanium, aluminum, diamonds, timber, diamonds and petroleum, copper, tobacco, cocoa. They have all the major natural resources that the world needs, uranium, and it's plentiful. We're talking about millions of tons of natural resources. And this is how the West European world have always gained their power. They have always gained their economic stability. Is through the rob and theft of the natural resources of the continent of Africa. Now, whether you consider yourself indigenous to the land of North America, you should like to believe that these are your brothers and sisters on another continent. They have different cultures and traditions, but more than likely, they will more probably be inclined to do business with you than the European hybrids that are depicted from the Caucasus Mountains in Europe. So who can better explain the situation of how this came to be? Well, I would like to show you a video. And also from that video, I would like to give you my commentary of what I believe in the research I've came up with. So as I prepared this for you, just stay with me. And I really want you to have your ears open, your eyes open to what the truth really is and what you have essentially been lied to.
One thing that keeps me puzzled, despite having studied finance and economics at the world's best universities, the following question remains unanswered. Why is it that 5,000 units of our currency is worth 1 unit of your currency, where we are the ones with the actual gold reserves? It's quite evident that the aid is in fact not coming from the West to Africa, but from Africa to the Western world. The Western world depends on Africa in every possible way, since alternative resources are scarce out here. So how does the West ensure that the free aid keeps coming? By systematically destabilizing the wealthiest African nations and their systems, and all that backed by huge PR campaigns, leaving the entire world under the impression that Africa is poor and dying and merely surviving on the mercy of the West. Well done, Oxfam, UNICEF, Red Cross, Life Aid, and all the other organizations that continuously run multi-million-dollar advertisement campaigns depicting charity porn to sustain that image of Africa globally. Ad campaigns paid for by innocent people under the impression to help with their donations. While one hand gives under the flashing lights of cameras, the other takes in the shadows. We all know the dollar is worthless, while the euro is merely charged with German intellect and technology, and maybe some Italian pasta. How can one expect donations from nations that have so little? It's super sweet of you to come with your colored paper in exchange for our gold and diamonds. But instead, you should come empty-handed, filled with integrity and honor. We want to share with you our wealth and invite you to share with us. The perception is that a healthy and thriving Africa would not disperse its resources as freely and cheaply, which is logical. Of course, it would instead sell its resources at world market prices, which in turn would destabilize and weaken Western economies, established on the post-colonial free meal system. Last year, the IMF reports that 6 out of 10 of the world's fastest growing economies are in Africa, measured by their GDP growth. The French Treasury, for example, is receiving about $500 billion year in, year out. The foreign exchange reserves from African countries based on colonial debt they forced them to pay. Former French President Jacques Chirac stated in an interview recently that we have to be honest and acknowledge that a big part of the money in our banks comes precisely from the exploitation of the African continent. In 2008, he stated that without Africa, France will slide down in the rank of a third world power. This is what happens in the human world, the world we have created. Have you ever wondered how things work in nature? One would assume that in evolution the fittest survives. However, in nature, any species that is overhunting, overexploiting the resources they depend on as nourishment, natural selection would sooner or later take the predator out because it offsets the balance.
Exactly.
One thing that
I
keeps me
couldn't say this
puzzled,
better myself, family.
despite having
But I do have my own narrative. I do have my own breakdown. Now, the question is, why is the continent of Africa so poor? And the answer is very, very simple. Because they have been subjugated under the system of white supremacy through colonization. So even though it's their own continent and they have over 800 million people, they have over 800 million Africans that live there. The question is, why didn't they rise up against smaller nations? Originally, those smaller nations came in as friends. And through that friendship, they found out a way to coerce governments and undertake and destabilize their economies and nations. But let me raise a couple of questions here on Google and see what exactly the white supremacist says. What is the greatest cause of poverty in Africa? Healthcare. Oh, okay. That's the greatest cause of healthcare. That's the greatest cause of poverty in Africa. Poor healthcare is a major cause of poverty in Africa because the poor cannot afford to purchase what is needed for good health, including sufficient quantities of quality food and healthcare itself, but not colonization, not enslavement of their people. When did Africa become poor? From 1974 through the mid 1990s, growth was negative, reaching negative 1.4%. As a consequence, hundreds of millions of African citizens have become poor. One half of the African continent lives below the poverty line. Nothing about white supremacy, colonization, and destabilizing the country. How is Africa poor? The latest estimate shows that the regional poverty rate decreased by 1.6% points between 2015 and 2018. This translates to 40% of the population living below the U.S. 1.9 day of poverty line in 2018 of sub-Sahara African, according to 2/3 of the global extreme poor population. Have you noticed that a continent that have been colonized for hundreds of years has no remnants or history or anything depicted when you look up why the continent is poor in the many countries they're in? Well, I have a different narrative, family. And when you have an opportunity to really break this down, please comment on this video and let me know truly, what do you think about my analytical breakdown of why Africa is poor? That's one of the world's top questions, because we understand in the 1400s, the Portuguese were the first European nation to use African slave labor to cultivate sugar plantations off the coast of West Africa. From then on through its peak in the 18th century, and then abolished in the late 1800s, the barbaric and dehumanizing trade in Africans will be the primary economic activity through which Europe's globalization efforts were funded. Because we understand that capitalism is utterly racist. This is a system of capitalism that we live in the Western world, whether it be here, Europe, and also in Asia. An estimated 11 million people, think about it, was forcibly taken into slavery in their new world, in the so-called new world. And the new world they wanted to depict as America, but also don't forget the many, many enslaved Africans that was dropped off in Brazil, also South America. Now, but comparable numbers were for centuries also across the Sahara, the Red Sea, and also the Indian Ocean, because they had slaves absolutely everywhere. And if you notice, earlier I spoke about how Portugal was the first European nation to enslave Africans, but the first nation to enslave Africans was Arabics, or the people, not the nation, the people. The Arabian people were the first. They had slaves in India as well. Now, what you have learned if you study African economics is that Africa's slave trades on subsequent economic development was unequivocal in many assessments that I broke down. Now, the African countries that are the poorest today are the ones from which the most slaves were taken. Because in some forms, people can become and are commodities. You need people to work to generate wealth. And that's what they have done. They have taken wealth from Africa, not only today's resources, but also their people. The enslavement of the melanated body made way for another equal brutal system, but one that elicits even less public sympathy. Now, back in 2002, now the president, Boris Johnson, wrote of Britain's colonial legacy in Africa. And that's why a lot of people say allegedly that Boris Johnson, the president of the UK, the president of whatever, is a bigot. He's a racist, because this is what he said back in 2016. He said the continent may be a blot, but it is not a blot upon our conscience. The problem is not that we were once in charge. He's talking about Africa, and he's talking about the UK. He said the problem is not that we were once in charge, but that we are not in charge anymore. And then in 2016, 44% of the people responded to a YouGov poll agreed with him, stating that Britain's colonial history was something to be proud of, saying that the colonization of Africa, we should be proud of that because it made us very, very rich. And we enslaved many melanated people that we care nothing about. And we still persecute today for many, many reasons in many sectors of life. As Francis Cresswell Wilson said, that white supremacy operates in all activities of life. Because the system of oppression is based on greed and white supremacy, see, that was not a lived experience for the inhabitants of these fair countries. See, as segregation in the U.S., our homeland, because it is still not taught in our school, it has been taken away like states like Texas. We delude ourselves into believing that empire was a noble cause. And we are charmed by the promises that politicians make to take us back to the good old days, like make America great again. But what period exactly are we trying to get back to? What period? Where it was peachy keen and gravy? What period of time was this? Why is this important to foundational Black Americans? Because you understand to understand your history, you may have to understand world history. And from your brothers and sisters in Africa doesn't mostly mean that you derive from Africa, because there's a lot of native melanated people that were born in ancestry right here on this land with no tether and ties to the continent of Africa, but we do have large similarities. So I call them as our brothers and sisters, just from another mother. All of Africa's colonial masters, this is what they've done. All of Africa's colonial masters, whether it be France, the UK, Spain, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Denmark, Finland, all of them played a role in this. All of Africa's colonial masters left behind a way of life completely decimated, a people traumatized and taught in colonial schools to loathe, to hate, to demise everything about themselves, their skin. Their skin. It doesn't matter where you live in the melanated community. The darker your skin, the more the hate. The lighter your skin, the better it'll be. The darker the skin, the more the hate. The lighter the skin, the better it will be. Their language. They took their natural, many hundreds of African languages and replaced it with colonial languages like French, Spanish, and English, and also Portuguese. Like countries like Mozambique and Angola speak Portuguese. A lot of Western countries within Africa speak French. And also there's a country in Africa, the only country in Africa that actually speaks Spanish. But let me show how the people look. And we're not talking about the Caribbean, like Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. Now, the country of Equatorial Guinea, the people speak Spanish and Portuguese and French. This is mainly because of colonization. But these are the people of the country, highly melanated. Highly melanated. So when I go and I look up the language of these people, I come with 3 colonial languages. I come up with 3 colonizer languages. These languages derive from Europe, not from the continent of Africa. Not from the continent of Africa. So when I look at the people, the only thing I see is high melanation. Nothing that tells me that these are Europeans that should be speaking French, Portuguese, and Spanish. But if you don't understand world history, you may not even understand your own history. Their clothes were replaced with colonial clothes. Their customs, their traditions were replaced. Even their gods and religion was replaced. Because nowadays, a lot of Africans are Christians, while the rest of them are Muslim. But where did Christianity derive from? A lot of people say, oh, no, it actually derived from Africa. No, it did not. The European colonizers brought Christianity to the continent of Africa. And they traumatized those people and made them hate themselves, their skin, their language, their clothing, their dress, their customs, their gods, their religion. Colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts and disfigures and destroys it. So a people seemingly with no past after colonization were now free to determine their own future. Post-colonial Africa was caught in the middle of the Cold War battle for ideological dominance, then crippled by structural adjustment policies of the World Bank and IMF, and is now at the mercy of multinational corporations whose bank balances, that's many times the size of many African economies, give them power to act in ways that are, if not always above the law, certainly outside of the moral maze. Now, there was a report that came out in May and it depicted and showed how resources flow in and out of Africa, saying that it reveals that the continent loses more money each year than it receives in aid. Did you hear me? Let me make sure this thing is on. Testing 1, testing 2. It says that this report has revealed that the continent of Africa loses more money each year than it receives in aid, investments, and remittances. Now, according to another study called the Honest Accounts of 2017, more than 3 times the amount Africa receives in aid was taken out mainly by multinational companies deliberately misreporting the value of their imports or exports to reduce tax. This is what they were doing. Now, along with these illicit financial flows, brain drain, debt servicing, and the cost of climate change, caused predominantly by the West, but played out on the world's poorest people, all make Africa a net creditor to the world. Oh, yeah. See, these examples speak to the way in which the global economic, trade, and information systems are set up. And they screw over African countries from unfair intellectual property laws to trade deals that force African countries to open up their markets to the rich world surplus production, destroying logical agricultural and manufacturing in the process. But this shouldn't be read as a get out of jail free card for African leaders, because they play a role in this too. They play a role of their cronies of the Western European powers. Now, they push back on these European countries. They may fear for their life, but this is what how you do to get out of colonial influence. And the half century since independence of all of these African nations, while economies have grown, and in the broadest sense, governance has improved, democracy on the continent is still failing. It is still faltering. The lack of transparency, accountability, safety, and the rule of law that often bloated public sectors and squeezed small businesses, masquerading as religion and culture, high unemployment rates, and recently, jihadism, destabilizing all the regions, if not all the regions, are the factors that are keeping Africans poor. Religion, unfair intellectual property laws, trade deals that force African countries to open up their markets to the rich. This is what keeping Africans poor, not healthcare. Not healthcare, family. What else does the white supremacist suspectedly have to say? Well, at Harvard, I asked the question, Harvard being one of the top Ivy League schools in the nation, in the world, it says, we argue that the main reasons that African nations are poor today is that their citizens have very bad interlocking economic and political incentives. Property rights are insecure and very insufficiently organized. Markets do not function well. States are weak and political systems do not provide public goods. Why is that? Have you heard of colonization? Have you heard of strategic destabilizations of nations and their governments and political factors? Did they mention that, Harvard? Or is Harvard blaming the victims of white supremacy? Let me move on. This is from thegrin.com. Evidence indicates that Africa has not achieved significant development over decades because most of its countries are poor. Duh. You're giving us the obvious answer. But the question is, why are they poor? These challenges can be contributed to the use of unreliable economic policies. I wonder why African nations have unreliable economic policies, other than the corrupt politicians that they have that was left by the European colonizers to do their biddings to keep them rich, and they'll keep them rich. They need their token Negroes, their coons and Sambos. And this is one of the main reasons why Native foundational Black Americans to North America, it's very, very hard for us to do business with our African brothers and sisters across the land. It is because of they have taught us in this land and also in theirs to hate ourselves and hate our own people that look like us. Whether you derived here in your ancestry right here in these North America, or you're one of the ancestors that came over with the enslaved Africans. If that's even true. Some people even argue that there were literally no ships able to carry 200, 300, 400 amount of people, and that the people that are originally on the land were the indigenous people of the land. But as a foundation of Black Americans, we should know that we are indigenous to this land. That if you follow your roots, you would never go back and hear someone of your lineage say that, yeah, your great grandfather said they came over on ships. But this is what they tell them, and this is what they tell us when we look them up. See, this is how they keep us all poor. Whether you are FBA or African American, meaning that you're from Africa and you became an American. This is how they keep us all poor, family, and especially those who are established and live in Africa. See, the statement is a sweeping generalization of why Africans are poor. Now, the kind you have to make when writing about 54 countries, that's how many countries there are in Africa, that every day millions of internet users are seeking to understand a continent rather than a specific country or a region, is in itself telling. I mean, the question about why Africa is so poor is loaded with bias and presume two things. The first is that there is a homogeneous place called Africa, and that Google search algorithm will find some pity yet quote to explain 54 distinctive trajectories of why they are poor. The second is the assumption is that there is something exceptional about Africa, that while other continents and people have got or are getting richer than Africans. Now, for reasons we can't think, but no longer speak in polite company, choose to remain in poverty. Our capacity to see Africa as divergent let us off the hook, so we don't have to understand our own complicit in the challenges various African countries face today. It also means we rarely rage as we should against the actions of the corporations and governments that profit from instability under the veil of white supremacy. See, corruption or even inexperience, those African negotiators, they have a disadvantage by the lack of experience and their expectations among the Western negotiators, because they should be grateful with whatever they get. That's what the Europeans tell them. This is what the Americans tell African negotiators when they're going through contracts and deals. You should be grateful with whatever you get. If there is no innate propensity for corruption, violence, or poverty in Africa, then the narratives that fuel the stereotypes need questioning. Now, one possible explanation comes from this Nigerian author. I forget his name, but he said, the West seems to suffer deep anxieties about the precautionariness of its civilization and to have a need for constant reassurance by comparison with Africa. Perhaps it's not Africa that needs saving, but it's them. Very, very powerful, ladies and gentlemen. That is my commentary on this topic, and hopefully you got something for it. Please leave your comments so we can have a discussion. to see where you guys are with this information. You guys have a great and wonderful afternoon. This is the Black Post. No matter if you loved it or hated, the message was delivered and the message was sent.